I think most of us never questioned what happens after a demigod dies. You kill them, take their Great Rune and move on. Great Runes really do pass to the victor, yet collecting them was never the original law of becoming Elden Lord. That may sound insignificant at first, but I don't think it is. Because when I started to look at the Tarnished who came before us, the timeline stopped making sense. We are told we need 2 Great Runes before the 2 fingers will acknowledge us. Enya celebrates when we arrive carrying them. The seal on Lendl only appears once we've proven ourselves. So naturally I assumed Vyke and Bernahl had done exactly the same thing. And then the question I couldn't answer appeared. If defeating a demigod transfers ownership of a Great Rune, why are all the demigods we fight still carrying theirs? And if Great Runes don't transfer, why do ours? Instead of starting with dialogue, let me start with the world itself. Because Elden Ring usually hides its biggest lore answers in stone, long before it hides them in words. The first clue is how ordinary the transfer actually is. There's no ceremony, no divine judgment, no moment where the Atri decides you are worthy. You defeat the shard bearer, the rune becomes yours. Not activated, but yours. Only afterward you climb Divine Tower to restore its power, which is an important sequence. The towers never grant ownership, they recognize ownership. Godric's tower doesn't care who you are. Radahn's tower doesn't reject you because you are an outsider. Every tower reacts to the rune, not the person carrying it. That makes the Great Runes feel less like souls and more like artifacts, objects that survive their owners. And the lens between worlds reinforces that idea everywhere. The demigod dies, the dynasty falls apart. Sometimes even the body barely remains, but the rune persists. It isn't buried with its bearer, it lives with the victor. That also fits what happened during the Shattering. The Great Runes were fragments of the Elden Ring divided among Marika's descendants after the ring broke. The demigods became shard bearers because they possessed those fragments, not because the fragments were part of their own souls. We casually say Godric's Great Rune or Radahn's Great Rune, but the Elden Ring lore never suggests those runes belong to them forever. They are simply the ones holding them. In that case, our experience isn't unique, it's the rule. Great Runes change hands through the conquest. And that is where the real problem begins. Because if previous Tarnished reached the same heights as we did, they should have been carrying those runes long before we arrived. Instead, every major demigod still has the rune we expect them to have, almost as nobody ever defeated them. But the game refuses to let us believe that. Vyke reached farther than anyone. Bernahl made it to the Forge of the Giants. These weren't failed adventurers, they almost finished the journey. So either they reached that point without defeating the same shard bearers, or we've misunderstood what the Great Rune requirement was actually doing. And that question changes the rest of my investigation. The easiest explanation is that Vyke fought demigods we never meet. The lens between is vast. Not every descendant of Marika appears on scene. The opening cinematic speaks broadly about shard bearers, and nothing explicitly states we've met every single one. That explanation works, at least at first. The problem is the world itself. Elden Ring usually leaves physical evidence behind. If entire lines of shard bearers rose and fell before our arrival, where is the abandoned Divine Tower? The ruined capital built around a forgotten claimant? The broken throne that tells us another succession war already happened. Instead, everything keeps pulling our attention back to the same rulers. Stormwell, Redmane Castle, Volcano Manor, Lendl. The places that shaped the Shattering are still occupied by the people we expect. Then I came back to Enya. She says she's seen 2 Great Runes brought together before. That is all she says. She never tells us who carried them, she never explains when she saw them. The line proves someone assembled 2 Great Runes before us. It doesn't prove how they got them. Then another detail stood out. The 2 fingers don't simply congratulate us, they allow us to continue. 2 Great Runes function as a checkpoint. Not a reward, but a checkpoint. That sounds like an internal law. Until you remember that Vyke belonged to a very different age. The round table once stood within Lendl. The 2 fingers still exercised visible authority there. Tarnished gathered openly instead of wandering a dying world in isolation. Everything about that era suggests a different political landscape. So maybe we've been making an assumption the Elden Ring lore never actually makes. Because our journey requires 2 Great Runes, we assume every Tarnished journey always did. But what if that is the wrong question? What if Great Runes have always changed hands, while the requirements to possess them change later? That possibility suddenly explains something the missing shard-bearer theory never could. It explains how Vyke should stand on the edge of becoming Elden Lord without forcing us to imagine entire kingdoms that somehow vanished without leaving a trace. For a while I thought that solved everything. Then I reached one piece of evidence that almost destroyed the entire theory. Because if two fingers really changed the rule, why does the game place Great Runes at the center of every shard-bearer we defeat? That isn't a small objection. It's the strongest argument against everything I've said so far. So this is where I expected the entire investigation to collapse. Because if Great Runes were only a political requirement imposed by the two fingers, why does the game spend so much effort building its world around them? Every shard-bearer is defined by one. Every divine tower exists because of one. The entire shattering happened because of them. Maybe the obvious answer really is a correct one. Maybe Great Runes are the foundation of becoming Elden Lord. Maybe Vyke and Bernahl defeated demigods will simply never meet. Or maybe there were once dozens of forgotten shard-bearers whose stories have been lost. It's a cleaner explanation. It preserves almost everything we are told. But let's look at the ending. Not the final boss, but the ending itself. Because that is where the role of the Great Runes quietly changes. Think about what actually repairs the Elden Ring. Not Godric's rune, not Radahn's, not Morgoth's, not all of them together. The thing that determines the world's future is the Mending Rune, the rune of the Death Prince, the Mending Rune of Perfect Order, the Fell Curse. Every alternate ending depends on a rune that was never taken from a demigod. Even the default ending is strange. The game never asks whether you've recovered every Great Rune, or even most of them. 2 are enough to enter Leyndell. After that, the requirement simply disappears. That doesn't prove Great Runes are not important. Far from it. They are unquestionably fragments of the Elden Ring. They are the source of the demigod status after the shattering. That is confirmed. But the game never explicitly says recovering every Great Rune is what makes someone Elden Lord. That is an assumption, and the ending quietly refuses to confirm it. Then I return to Anya one last time. Listen carefully to what she actually says. She tells us to seek another Great Rune before approaching the Earth Tree. She gives us an instruction, not an explanation. Those are very different things. Why they were giving that particular instruction? Because if the requirement changed, something must have forced it to change. And that realization leads me to one distinction that reframes the entire mystery. The mistake, I think, is treating two different systems as one. They are not. One governs the Great Runes, the other governs access to the Earth Tree. The first is simple: defeat the Shardbearer, take the rune, restore it at a divine tower. Nothing in that sequence suggests the two fingers have any role at all. The second system begins much later, at the gates of Leyndell. That is where the fingers intervene. Not a Stormvale, not a Redmane Castle, not a Volcano Manor, only when we try to move beyond the capital. The difference matters because artifacts don't create checkpoints, institutions do. And once I separated those two ideas, the timeline became surprisingly coherent. Great Runes always changed owners. Our own journey demonstrates that. The uncertainty begins only when we ask what owning those runes actually allowed someone to do. Now let's imagine the world before our arrival. The old round table still operates in Leyndell, two fingers still command authority. Vyke reaches the mountaintops, Bernahl reaches the forge. Then everything falls apart. The Tarnished fail. Some abandon their purpose. One embraces the frenzied flame. The round table empties. Leyndell seals itself away. The fingers lose control of the world they once directed. Suddenly, demanding two Great Runes before anyone enters the capital doesn't feel like an internal law. It feels like a response, a new filter. Not because Great Runes suddenly became magical keys, but because killing a Shardbearer proves something. Maybe strength, maybe resolve, and perhaps, most importantly, one less rival standing between the fingers and the throne they want restored. That doesn't require resurrected demigods, it doesn't require invisible dynasties, it doesn't require dozens of forgotten Great Runes hidden somewhere off-screen. It only requires accepting that political system involved after failure. The Great Runes stayed the same, the rules surrounding them are not. And that also explains why the runes never feel personal. Godric doesn't create his rune, Radahn doesn't shape his, the divine towers don't belong to individual bloodlines. Every structure treats the rune like an object that will inevitably outline its current owner, almost like a crown. Kings die, crowns remain, someone else wears them. That is exactly how Great Runes behave, not as piece of demigod's identity, but as fragments of authority waiting for the next claimant. In the end, I don't think the biggest mystery is what happens to Great Rune after Demigod dies. The game already shows us that it changes hands. The real mystery is why we assume every Tarnished before us followed the same path we did. Once that assumption disappears, a surprising number of contradictions disappear with it. Vyke no longer needs a secret list of defeated demigods. Bernahl no longer requires forgotten kingdoms hidden somewhere beyond the map. The Great Runes remain exactly what the world shows them to be, enduring fragments of the Elden Ring that survive every owner. What changes is a system built around them. The rules, the gatekeepers, the requirements. Maybe that is a point Elden Ring has been making all along. The relics never changed. The people trying to control them did. And if the Two Fingers could redefine the path to the Erdtree after the generation of Tarnished failed, how many other rules we accept as ancient truth are really just the latest version of someone else's plan? Thanks for watching, hit that like button and subscribe for more Elden Ring and other Souls-like games lore and guide videos, and stay sharp out there, Tarnished.